In order to understand John Rawls' political philosophy, I think it's helpful to start with the idea of a conception of justice. What is a conception of justice? Well, let's start out with this idea of conceptions. Rawls is working with a distinction between concepts and conceptions. Right? So a concept is a broad notion of what a term means. Right? So it would be something like a very broad definition of justice. Right? Or if we did something else, if we said, okay, well, what about the notion of species in science? Right? Well, let's look at the notion of species. Right? We could say, okay, the concept is that it is something that differentiates different types of animals. Okay? Now then we get into conceptions, which would be different, very specific understandings of what it means for something to be a species. Right? One person might say, well, look, it has something to do with the structure of the animal. Another might say it's the evolutionary history. Another might say it has to do with reproduction. Right? The idea is something like this. They're disagreeing about the proper way to understand species. Right? But it's not like one person's talking about economics and another person's talking about biology. Right? There's this concept there. There's this rough understanding of what it means for something to be a species, right? But that's incomplete. Right? It's enough that they can agree we're disagreeing about the same thing. Right? There's something out there, something important, right? And we disagree about the nature of what it is. And our different understandings of what the nature of it is would be our conceptions. Right? Now, of course, for practical purposes, if you're going to get stuff done, you kind of need to have a conception. Right? So there's this distinction between concept and conception. Right? So justice as a broad idea is something like treating people right, or something like that. We basically understand when people disagree about what is just and unjust, what they mean by justice. Right? But then we discover they might have very different conceptions of justice. Right? I sometimes use the example of ancient Israel, right? Where the idea of justice had something to do, first of all, it was not so focused on individuals, it was focused on families. Right? And justice was seen something about following a certain sort of law and customary tradition. Right? In contrast, we tend to think more in terms of individuals and rights and change and development. Right? Now, of course, that example was very far afield. Rawls is concerned with things that are closer to what he believes. Right? But the idea is that there's a number of conceptions of justice. Right? So a conception of justice is a specific understanding of what it means for a set of policies, a set of economic structures, a set of political structures to be just or unjust. Right? So usually for Rawls, that's going to mean some kind of set of basic principles that people within a society could look to and say, well, look, we as a society have accepted this conception of justice. And given that agreement on the basic of principles, we can look at our systems of property arrangement or our marriage laws or our anti-discrimination laws or something else and decide whether or not those are just. Right? That is, we can decide whether or not a particular policy is something we're obligated to have, it's a legitimate option, or it's something that's absolutely forbidden. Right? So Rawls is going to present us with a conception of justice. Right? But he also says that there are other conceptions of justice out there. And to some extent, we need to talk about the relationships between different conceptions of justice and the relationship between a conception of justice and a society. Right? In the next several segments, I'm going to go into more detail about what a conception of justice is and what its function is in Rawls' philosophy and in society as a whole.